Hi everyone, I'm Vcast. Welcome to the program. In today's discussion, we're going to take a look at the concept of ownership. In our earlier video casts on behaviors and on influential communications and on how to succeed in the organization, we've sort of touched upon ownership. We've made references to it, but we haven't directly looked at it. In today's discussion, we're going to correct that and take a good hard look at the concept of ownership and why it is such a great thing, why it is such a powerful force in our lives. So let's look at our agenda. Now, the first topic of assets may seem a little strange. I mean, what's that all about? What do assets have to deal with ownership? But if you think about the common usage of the term ownership, to be in possession of something, to own a car, to own a house, to own a shirt, okay? These are all tangible physical things that are assets. They're things that are in your care. Well, in an organizational setting, they don't own cars and houses and things like that, but you are placed in possession of things that are of value, are important, are assets to the organization that are in your care. And we're going to talk about that concept in a little more detail because it's important to understand as we go through the rest of the discussion. The second concept is the value chain. What this brings out is that ownership is a state-sensitive concept, and that is it changes over time or as events take place in the organization. So when we think of assets in an organization, they move through a transaction life cycle of various flavors, and that affects ownership in how it's expressed, when it's expected, and what forms it takes on. Now that may sound a little murky, but it'll make sense in a moment when we get to it. And then our third agenda item here is where we blow all that smoke away, and where we break down ownership into its constituent elements so you can see that it's not just some ephemeral positive quality, it's actually something that can be broken down into tangible components that can be observed and measured. So that going forward, you'll know ownership when you see it, and you'll know how authentic it is, and you'll know how to model it yourself. And finally, we'll close by looking at why ownership is such great stuff. Why is it such a valuable commodity in the organizational context? This may be self-evident to many of you, but I think it will benefit from some considered attention here at the end as well. Okay, so let's move on to seeing what this assets is all about. We define ownership as follows. I'm going to do a dramatic reading of this because it's very important. Ownership is the unequivocal behavior that expresses both personal dedication and near unlimited accountability for maturing an asset. Clearly a great many loaded words there. Unequivocal behavior, that is, behavior that is clearly evident. It is not questionable in terms of its form or its intentions. It is crystal clear. This behavior is expressing two things: personal dedication and unlimited or near unlimited accountability. And all of this is directed at maturing an asset. Now when we say asset, we mean something of value that is in your care. And that thing of value could be something tangible or intangible. It could be something tangible like a car or a business or even a child, or something intangible like a project or a responsibility. Now clearly we're focused upon an organizational context here, so we're thinking more of having a business or a project or a responsibility in your care. But what is important to understand here is that we are not speaking of the classical understanding of ownership as simply the right of possession. Rather, we are more focused upon the responsibility side of possessing something. With or without the right of possession, one may still have a responsibility to the asset. In fact, this is one of the key attributes of ownership that we're going to talk about in a couple of pages here, is that an owner doesn't have to own something to behave as an owner. They assume the responsibility for care of an asset irrespective of whether they have a publicly declared right of possession. And that is one of the most distinguishing features of an owner. It is someone who is clearly dedicated to maturing this asset, irrespective of whether they possess it or not. But the expectations around the asset are not passive, they're active. There is an intention for this asset to grow, to flower, to mature, to blossom into something more valuable than the asset presently is. Something is supposed to happen with this asset for it to yield returns that a stakeholder of the asset is expecting. So there's more than just a safeguard or protective role of the owner here. There's a responsibility to do something with the asset that is material. And finally, central to the concept of ownership is the behavior of the individual. Fundamentally, ownership is about manifesting a certain type of behavior, a behavior that expresses this dedication, this accountability, and drive to realize the asset's value. What's interesting about this definition of ownership is that there's an inherent tension inside of it. When you're an owner of something, when you possess something, there's an implicit responsibility to safeguard it. You have a fiduciary responsibility to it. But with this definition, that's insufficient. It's important, but it's insufficient. You have a responsibility to mature this asset, to cure it, to hammer it into shape, to make it into more than the material that was given you. And to do that, you may need to expose it to forces and threats that, while helpful in maturing or improving the asset, are also a genuine threat to it. And it's up to you as the owner to balance that tension in such a way that you realize the potential of that asset. And that requires you to act in a certain way. Ownership requires you to act in an authentic and selfless manner with regard to your duty to the asset. One of the best ways of looking at this is, suppose you had a small business. You're the owner of a small business. You have to hold yourself to a higher standard than everyone else around you, all of your employees. It's all on you. So you have got to have attention to detail. You have got to be willing to work the long hours. You have got to be willing to do without in order to have this business thrive. You have got to be willing to give it your all without regard to what may be your best interest. In short, you're placing the interests of the business above your own interests. It is this type of selfless, authentic conduct, this personal dedication of unlimited accountability, that makes ownership the gold standard of personal conduct. And now let's move on to the value chain, which talks about how assets move into your care and what you do with them. Here with this big arrow, all we're doing is providing a graphic representation of the idea that an asset goes from an initial state to a more mature state, so asset maturation is going off to the right. So you're becoming more mature as an asset as you move to the right. And there are 3 points along this value chain that are of interest. They are the transfer of the asset, your conduct with regard to the asset when it's in your care. This is where you're in possession of the asset, you're in executing mode. And then finally, does the asset realize its potential? Does it achieve its goal? Do you succeed in meeting the expectations that were set for the asset? Now, looking at the first point here, the transfer of assets. In an organizational context, most assets, responsibilities, departments, physical assets like equipment, are in someone else's care, but they are transferred to your care. And there are basically 3 ways an asset can come to you. You can seek an asset, and this is where you either petition the holder of an existing asset to give it to you for your custody and attention, or you can create a new asset by using organizational resources in new ways in order to create something that didn't exist before. Accepting an asset is a little bit different. Here, the holder of the asset approaches you and asks for your consent to accept responsibility for the asset. And finally, in assignment, the holder charges you with responsibility for the asset with or without your consent. And as we'll see in a moment, these methods of conveyance of the asset have very important implications. But before delving into those, let's move on to conduct. Now, it's in the second point of the conduct phase of asset maturation that ownership is expressed. So this is the area in which the public, where all stakeholders have a chance to see whether you behave as an owner or not, by observing how you behave with regard to the asset, irrespective of the manner in which you received it or whether that asset achieves its goals or not. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But for now, what you need to understand is that this conduct phase, this conduct milestone, is really where ownership expresses itself. What's key to understand about conduct is that there are 2 components that express your conduct. One is your competency and the other is your behavior. When I say competency, I mean there's an underlying assumption that when an asset is given into your care, that you are competent in being able to meet the expectations of caring for and maturing that asset. Now, it's important to note that this assumption of competency is frequently wrong. In fact, it's one of the greatest sources of failure in moving assets among an organization, in that people can overestimate their own capabilities and bite off more than they can chew, or that superiors can misassess the skills of an individual and give them more than they can handle, and what ends up happening is that expectations are missed. But assessing competency and making informed decisions based on competency is something that we will discuss when we get to the videocast of staff development. So for now, what we'll do is we'll just assume that you do have the competency to meet the expectations surrounding the asset, and instead what we'll do is we'll focus upon behavior and how you express that dedication, that personal commitment, and that unlimited liability attribute required in order to mature an asset to meet those expectations. Now, as you would expect, when it comes to personal dedication and modeling of accountability, there's a broad spectrum of behaviors that can be arrayed around multiple axes, everything ranging from a plunderer to a facilitator to a steward to the highest level of an owner, and we'll talk more about how that works in just a moment. But how you choose to behave in this conduct phase of asset maturation is where you will show the other stakeholders whether you are an owner or something else. And regardless of what behavior you actually model, there is an expectation associated with the asset that it will achieve some goal in time, and that there will be an assessment of whether we succeeded or not. Did this asset yield what we expected it to do? Did it meet our expectations? Now, interestingly, ownership is focused upon your conduct with regard to your responsibilities, and it can be independent of how the asset was transferred to you and whether you succeeded or not. Let me say that another way. While ownership is meant to indicate a higher probability of goal attainment, you could behave as an owner and still fail to have that asset succeed in meeting its expectations because there are forces beyond your control. Luck plays a role here. You didn't have the competency levels you needed. There were exogenous forces acting on you. You didn't have proper management support, whatever. You could have had any of those things prevent this asset from realizing its expectations, but you still could have behaved as an owner in executing your responsibilities to try and get that asset to realize its potential. Similarly, the manner in which the asset was transferred to you can affect how you behave as well, and you can model ownership irrespective of the manner in which it was transferred to you. And we'll talk about that with an example in just a sec, because it's a very important illustration of how ownership manifests itself. Now, underpinning this value chain are two central and interrelated concepts. One is accountability. Bottom line is that we're seeing the movement of assets through a value chain. The asset is going from person A to person B, and person B is expected to mature that asset to achieve some goal. While as an asset moves through this value chain, we're expecting accountability to move with it. When person A gives the asset to person B, they're transferring a lot of the accountability, if not all of the accountability, for that asset to person B. And then person B is expected to achieve the goal assigned to it. Now, they may behave as an owner and not achieve that goal, but that doesn't change the accountability attribute that is associated with that asset. Further, and more fundamentally, there is a trust component around the expectations that are pinned to the asset. We all know how hard and laborious it can be to define all the requirements and all the expectations associated with a given project or responsibility. And at some point we have to say enough's enough and say, okay, I've given you as much guidance and explicit expectation as I can. I'm now going to have to trust that you are sensitive enough to perceive all the other expectations associated with this asset that I have not explicitly stated, and will be able to honor those expectations. So there's not just the mechanical life cycle of the asset that ownership operates on. It is operating in a context that is suffused with accountability and trust. And an owner recognizes this environment and consciously operates in the best interest of the asset, even though that may place the owner at greater risk. Now, this may seem a little bit abstract, so what I want to do here is provide you a model that may make this ownership concept more tangible. And what we're going to do is we're going to focus upon the transfer step in the asset maturation. Let's say at the very beginning, when the asset is in someone else's care, there is a host of expectations associated with it. There's any number of expectations. There's a range of what things are expected, and here we have 1 to infinity. So there's all sorts of things that someone may expect of this. But there's also a depth to those expectations. It's not just a case of what. There's also a quality and a substance of each expectation that is comprehended in all the expectations associated with this asset. And all of these expectations, in some way, shape, or form, are going to move through the asset maturation life cycle here, whether they are articulated or not. And so let's look what happens in the transfer stage. Let's look at a situation where you are seeking accountability for an asset.